Hello friends, this is Grief speaking, and today we're digging into part 2 of the Disturbing Comic Book Iceberg. It's been a while since I first posted part 1. In fact, in that video, I was thankful for hitting 50,000 subscribers. Little did I know I'd be sitting at well over 100,000 by the time I posted part 2, which is crazy. So thank you guys for all the support these last few months. There's a lot of really weird and disturbing comic books and graphic novels in tiers 3 and 4, so I'm really excited to get into this. Shout out to Bloody Locks Bathory for creating this iceberg. As I said before, creating an iceberg like this is just as hard as explaining it, if not harder, so big thank you to them. But let's not waste any more time. This is the Disturbing Comic Book Iceberg Explained, Part 2. So let's move into level 3, Trippy, starting with Beautiful Darkness. Beautiful Darkness is a French comic that follows Princess Aurora, the leader of a group of tiny people that emerge from the corpse of a little girl in the woods. Its cute aesthetic clashes with this dark and unforgiving world as the small people are picked off one by the environment as well as each other. It's been described as Thumbelina meets Lord of the Flies, and the small people dying in brutal ways is only half of it. Let's not forget the slowly rotting corpse of the dead girl lying nearby. I did a full start to finish breakdown of this book in another video, so go check that out if you're interested. Clean Room. Clean Room follows journalist Chloe Pierce as she investigates a cult, the Honest World Foundation, after her fiance's suicide, which was triggered by their teachings. It's led by Astrid Mueller, a ruthless woman with access to a clean room, a terrifying chamber where people's deepest fears and traumas are revealed, exposing horrifying otherworldly entities that secretly manipulate human minds. Basically, Astrid is fighting an invisible war against inhuman creatures that feed on suffering and drive people to madness and death. The series is pretty disturbing, mostly because of its body horror elements and gore, especially in the actual clean room where there is all kinds of crazy shit going down. It's really pretty messed up on every level. Crumple, the status of Knuckle. Unfortunately, I could not find this comic anywhere online, and it would take way too long and cost way too much to buy off eBay. From what I understand, the comic follows Knuckle, a socially awkward, self-hating artist who's constantly humiliated. Most people who have talked about this comic seem to mention the art, which is very exaggerated and grotesque, and that there is a lot of sexual imagery that's both subtle and explicit throughout. If anyone has read this and wants to break it down in the comment section, feel free, and I'd be happy to dig deeper into it at some point. Ed the Happy Clown. This is easily one of the most messed up and bizarre comics I've seen so far. It follows Ed the Clown and the series of horrible events that happen to him. He starts off just a normal happy clown, but suddenly his leg snaps while he's walking down the street. Then hordes of rats come out to start eating his disfigured leg, I guess. Meanwhile, the mayor is about to put his rat removal program into action, which entails bringing rat-eating pygmies from a third world country in to exterminate them. But the way they go about doing this is by dropping the pygmies from a plane over the city, so they all just fall to their deaths splattering on the street. On the upside, Ed the Clown is saved because the rats leave him alone to feast on the small corpses instead. By the way, that's just the opening. This comic is batshit crazy. Besides Ed, there are a lot of little vignettes, like an ongoing segment called Adventures in Science that usually showcases some strange or unexplained event, like a group of scientists trying to study a squid beating off, or a man who's stuck on the toilet and can't seem to stop defecating to the point where the entire bathroom is filled up with his excrement. Usually these stories connect back to Ed somehow, who continues his string of bad luck by being framed for chopping off a dude's hand and sent to jail. It's revolting, it's vile, but you can't say it's not entertaining. This would be a fun one to do a full start to finish on. The Filth. The Filth follows Greg Feely, a seemingly ordinary bachelor living with his cat and, watching the news. His life is upended one day when he finds a strange woman in his shower with a comb over who tells him he's actually Ned Slade, an agent for an extra-dimensional organization called The Hand, dedicated to maintaining status quo by suppressing threats to social hygiene, or as his commander, Mother Dirt, says, they are the hand that wipes the ass of the world. As Slade, he faces bizarre missions, like when he goes to an area called the Crack, where time moves so quickly that anyone without a protective suit will die of old age in minutes, or when he stops a megalomaniac pornographer, Tex Porno, from destroying womankind with giant mutant sperm. It's honestly insane, and The Filth is a perfect title because this whole comic is chock full of sleazy material. but if you have a really dark sense of humor and morbid curiosity, might be worth checking out. Gideon Falls. Gideon Falls is a psychological horror comic that intertwines two seemingly unrelated narratives: a reclusive, mentally ill man named Norton Sinclair who obsessively collects pieces of trash, believing they reveal an important dark secret, and Father Wilfred, a newly assigned priest in a small town who finds a woman's mutilated corpse. Both of these individuals, miles apart, have the same vision of a black barn. The black barn is an ominous, shifting entity appearing throughout history, bringing madness and death wherever it manifests. It's a great idea and one of those entries that I just couldn't stop reading. I Breathed a Body. This is a Cronenberg-inspired tech thriller. It takes place in the near future where social media dominance has reached disturbing extremes and focuses on the world's biggest influencer, Milo, and his father Bastian, who owns a massive social media empire that controls trends and engagement at an almost godlike level. You can easily see that the inspiration for Milo is based on many of the unhinged real-life influencers like the Paul brothers. The comic actually opens with Milo doing an apology video for a prank he did that went wrong, and it's not far off from stuff we've seen in recent years. Now, a dystopian social media controlled future is disturbing enough, but the real horror of this comic comes from the fact that Milo was actually created by his father to become an influencer since the day he was born. He's made of a fungus-like substance that can regenerate and be reshaped. In the big inciting incident of issue 1, Milo basically rips his flesh off while live streaming. Instead of sending his audience into an uproar, this only garners him more followers. So after this, the social media company begins growing new bodies out of him, creating grotesque structures of flesh and bone that are displayed as content for the world to consume. It's a fascinating way of taking the strange, unapologetic world of content-hungry influencers and social media sites and making them into a Hellraiser-like horror show. Jim Woodring's works. This is a weird one. Jim Woodring is a cartoonist and comic writer best known for his dream-based comics. From a young age, Woodring experienced hallucinatory apparitions which have been the inspiration for much of his work. He famously keeps a journal where he writes down his hallucinations and dreams in the form of cartoons, which often form the basis for his comics and art pieces. His two notable comics are Jim and Frank. Jim is a less structured comic, largely coming from Jim's auto journal, and features a mix of different kinds of surreal comics and written pieces. It was originally a self-published zine before being picked up by Fantagraphics in 1986, but probably Jim's most well-known work is a comic called Frank. Frank is a sort of ambiguous, anthropomorphic animal who explores the Unifactor, a world that operates on dream logic and features strange and fantastic art and symbols that are largely based on Woodring's belief in Hindu philosophy. On some level, these comics are typical cartoony hijinks, but the world is drenched in bizarre symbolism and disturbing themes and characters like the Man-Hog, a creepy, fleshy creature that takes on different roles depending on the story. This is one of those entries that I could make a whole video on, honestly. Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. You might instantly recognize the art style of this comic if you're a fan of Invader Zim. Well, before that more kid-friendly cartoon, the creator, Jonan Vasquez, made a highly disturbing 7-issue comic called Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, and it's absolutely bonkers. It follows the titular maniac, Johnny, as he kills and tortures random people as well as ranting about society. There's also tons of little vignettes in between, like the stories of a little creature named Wobbly-Headed Bob, who's a complete cynic and nihilist. If you haven't seen it already, I did a massive breakdown of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac that you can find on my channel. Lift Your Leg, My Fish is Dead. Okay, I couldn't find this comic anywhere, but then I realized that Lift Your Leg, My Fish is Dead is actually a collection of works from Julie Doucet, and that most of it's from her comic Dirty Plot, which I was able to find, so I'll mostly be pulling from that. Most of the stories in this comic are semi-autobiographical about the struggles of being a woman and an alternative cartoonist. The reason that this comic is on the list is its gritty show-all style. It gets into the gritty details of everything, both in story and art. It's full of sex and nudity, body horror, and just a ton of unsettling images. It really shows the griminess of everyday life and has a surreal, gross-out feel. Just to give you an idea of what to expect, there is a sequence where a woman visits her friend and his dog is a giant, filling the entire apartment. The guy shows off his monster dog's magnum dong and starts yelling into it until he hears an echo coming back. It's a real what the fuck am I reading kind of comic, like a velvet glove cast in iron. This comic starts off with a man named Clay in an adult film theater. A fetish film plays called Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron, and one of the actresses in it looks exactly like Clay's ex-wife. This sends him on a journey to find her, but along the way he encounters several unhinged and disturbing individuals. Clay slowly loses his mind as well and often hallucinates hallucinates things, making the reader unsure of what's real. He's picked up and abused by two a-hole cops who leave him to die in the woods, then he's rescued by a bizarre cult, and it just gets more and more chaotic from there. It's full of disturbing images, body horror, nightmare sequences, and the list goes on. Michael DeForge's work. Michael DeForge has an instantly recognizable style. His art is pretty unique and eye-catching, but at the same time, kind of unsettling. He's done many different kinds of stories, but they're often humorous with disturbing elements. Ripple, a predilection for Tina. Well, I can't really show too much of this one because it's one of the more nude-heavy entries. Essentially, a children's book artist wants to do something more avant-garde, so he decides to put together an art exhibit showcasing exotica of traditionally unattractive women. Of course, every girl he approaches to participate in this is pretty insulted until he finally meets Tina, who takes him up on the offer. From here, she becomes his muse. He draws her in all kinds of exotic poses, and then he becomes obsessed with her. Part of why this is considered unsettling is the strange sexual relationship they get into, displayed in almost body horror level grotesque detail by the author's disturbing art style. Rory Hayes' work. Rory Hayes was a big contributor to the underground comic scene of the 60s and 70s. He completely self-produced his own comics from a young age. After writing for several prominent underground comics, he had success with his own comic called Bogeyman, a collection of horror stories featuring heavy violence and gore. He also had a shock exploitation comic that was literally called Comics. Of course, I can't really show any of it because there's basically disturbing sex acts on every page, often with violence thrown in. This wasn't the only comic like this at the time either, but the point is, Rory Hayes was a weird guy who made even weirder comics. Saga of the Swamp Thing. This particular run of Swamp Thing was done by Alan Moore, so of course it pushed some boundaries, but mostly Moore really got into the nitty-gritty existential horror of the character. Instead of a man turned to a monster, this version of Swamp Thing is actually just a plant elemental that has the memories of a man, Alec Holland, and has to contend with this disturbing identity crisis. Of course, there's a ton of body horror throughout, but one of the most disturbing and controversial moments is regarding Abigail Arcane, the Swamp Thing's reoccurring love interest. Abigail's alcoholic husband begins to force himself on her sexually, which is disturbing enough, but it's later revealed that it was actually her own uncle doing this. The dude's a sorcerer and was actually possessing her dead husband's body to do this. You know, that old award-winning combo of incest and necrophilia. Stray Toasters. Stray Toasters follows a criminal psychologist recently released from a mental institution who's drawn into investigating a series of gruesome murders involving women and children. But the really disturbing aspect of this comic is the style and narrative structure. It incorporates oil paintings, collage, and mixed media to create a pretty insane look. On top of that, the story is non-linear and told in such a twisted way that the whole thing feels like a schizophrenic nightmare. Terminal Hero. Terminal Hero follows Rory Fletcher, a young doctor diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor. Out of desperation, he volunteers for an experimental procedure known as the Template, a highly secretive treatment developed by the military. The treatment works, but has some side effects, mainly superhuman powers. Not just any powers, the dude can straight up alter reality. At first, he uses this power on accident, like when he hears a little girl crying and wants her to shut up. Then suddenly stitches appear on her face and stitch her mouth shut. Pretty disturbing. Along with his powers, Fletcher has crazy impulses and urges. He starts doing hardcore drugs and spends all of his savings on prostitutes that he cheats on his girlfriend with. So as his life goes downhill, he begins to become more sinister, and the darker side of his powers emerge. It's full of all kinds of debauchery and body horror. Transit. Transit follows a drifter as he travels through a grimy dystopian city full of urban decay and social collapse. We get a snapshot of this depressing city as Jake encounters all manners of people, crime, and corruption, sometimes being a part of it himself. It's got a really unique art style that kind of reminds me of the Metal Slug games. A Walk Through Hell. This comic follows two agents as they enter an abandoned warehouse that essentially transports them to a kind of hell. Time passes differently inside, and they slowly descend into madness. They encounter highly disturbing situations and are forced to confront their past traumas. W the Whore. This one was only recently published in English, and I didn't get a chance to really read it, but from what I understand, the series follows W the Whore, a nameless woman as she navigates different facets of womanhood told through fairy tale-like vignettes. The harsh reality of the woman's life is pretty unsettling by itself, but the art here is pretty creepy. Zap Comics. So Robert Crumb was a real pioneer in the underground comics movement and is known for his cartoony style and X-rated subject matter. Zap Comics is basically a series of shorts that are all over-the-top smut, including violence, hardcore nudity, and adult themes. There's not much to say about these. stories. I know they were groundbreaking at the time, but now they're just sort of edgy for the sake of it. Alright, that wraps up tier 3, and we're moving into tier 4, Depressing. Starting with Battlefields, Dear Billy. Battlefields is a series of stories set in World War II. They all showcase the brutality of war, but the Dear Billy story is particularly disturbing. The story follows a woman named Carrie writing a letter to her lover, which serves as a sort of narration. It starts off right in the shit as Carrie explains how her and a group of other women were raped by Japanese soldiers and then killed. Carrie miraculously survives this and is rescued, although suffers a terrible leg wound. After she's healed up, she works as a nurse for wounded soldiers. One day, a Japanese soldier is admitted after surrendering, and Carrie suffocates him in his sleep. After this, she begins to kill any Japanese that come in, all the while maintaining a new relationship she has with Billy. That's the gist of it, but there is a ton of brutal war violence peppered in as well. Black River. This is a really dark post-apocalypse comic. It follows a group of women who are just trying to survive in the horrible aftermath of some unknown apocalyptic event. They're doing okay at the start, but it's a really bleak world, and most of them have mental illnesses. Soon things go really bad when a group of men take them hostage and take turns using them. One girl is on the brink of starvation, so they throw her in a pit and stone her. It's really gruesome. The girls eventually escape and get their brutal revenge, but that doesn't remove the trauma, and the girls continue to wander on, going insane, some seeing hallucinations and others straight up themselves. Black River is not for the faint of heart. The Closet. The Closet is more sad than disturbing. It's about a 4-year-old boy named Jamie who keeps seeing a monster in his closet at night. His father Tom is a real piece of work and becomes more unlikable as the story goes on, but he's pretty dismissive about the monster, which just keeps coming after the kid. I don't want to spoil the ending, but it's clear from the start that the monster the kid is seeing is a side effect of his a-hole dad's behavior. A Contract with God. This one is notable, if anything, because it actually is known for popularizing the term graphic novel after it released in 1978. It's a series of short stories that all take place in an apartment building in New York City. The stories are pretty bleak at times. In one story, the superintendent, Mr. Scruggs, is shown to be an anti-Semitic a-hole and also kind of a pervert. His apartment's covered in nude photos. One day, a niece of one of the tenants stops by and offers to show him her panties for a nickel, which he does, but she has some other motives in mind. She gives his dog poison and steals his money. He chases her down, and everyone calls him a creep and sex maniac. He returns to his apartment to hold his dead dog before he pulls out a gun and offs himself. Pretty dark stuff. Daddy's Girl. This comic follows Lily, a young girl who's abused by her father. It doesn't shy away from the details and is a blunt look at the reality of such a crime. It also deals with the aftermath of this trauma, which the girl deals with by eating and has trouble forming normal relationships. Pretty sad, and I don't have much more to say on it. The Dregs. This was a pretty cool one. It's about a section of a city, 5 square blocks, called the Dregs. It's a dangerous area filled with the homeless, drugs, and death. However, the area is in the middle of being gentrified, with trendy restaurants opening up on every corner. Strangely, some of the street people of the area begin to go missing. A homeless man named Arnold, who's obsessed with detective fiction, starts to piece together where they're going. Turns out that they're being kidnapped and turned into the very food that the rich are eating at the fancy restaurants. The poverty and despair in the streets is bad enough, but this comic spares no detail in its graphic depictions of the people being dismembered and served up. Echoes. Echoes follows Brian, a man with schizophrenia who manages to keep it under control with medication and support from his pregnant wife. On his deathbed, Brian's father admits to a horrible crime and instructs Brian to find a box hidden in the crawlspace of his house. So Brian checks it out, and in the crawlspace finds a pile of small bones and the box. In the box is a collection of small dolls made from the bones and flesh of little girls that were murdered. Yeah, pretty dark stuff. So Brian now has to deal with the revelation that his father was a child serial killer, which of course sends him spiraling out of control. Fell. Richard Fell is a detective who's recently been transferred to Snowtown, an urban rat hole full of crime and decay. The setting itself is already depressing. The gloomy streets are filled with people living miserable lives while violence and abuse runs rampant. In each issue, Fell tackles a different situation, but they're almost always pretty disturbing. Like a man whose wife kills him by giving him alcohol poisoning through his butt, several bodies floating in the river every week, and in one of the gnarliest, a man who believes in Vietnamese magic cuts the fetuses out of pregnant women and hangs them in his apartment to ward off evil spirits. It's It's pretty gritty, but if you want a good detective comic, this one actually hooked me. Flughunde, published in English as Voices in the Dark. From what I understand, this is an adaptation of a novel that follows the fictional life of Helga Goebbels, the daughter of German World War II Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels. It also follows Hermann Knau, a sound engineer obsessed with human voices and his disturbing fascination with recording and analyzing them, leading him to conduct unethical experiments under the Nazi regime. Hard Looks. Hard Looks is an anthology series featuring adaptations of short stories by Andrew Vax, typically centering on gritty crimes. They feature all manner of violence and horrific situations. Like the very first story, for instance, follows a couple of crooked cops who violate women and then throw their corpses in a dump afterwards. You know, that kind of stuff. It was the War of the Trenches. This comic is all about the trench warfare during World War II, focusing on the day-to-day lives of men holed up in trenches. It's known for being extremely factual and brutally realistic, taking from actual accounts and stories of some of the horrific things that happened in these situations. Jimmy Corrigan. Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on earth, is considered one of the most important graphic novels ever made. It follows a 36-year-old office worker with crippling social anxiety and an overbearing mother. One day he gets a letter from his estranged father and decides to meet up with him. At the same time, the narrative shifts to older generations of Corrigans from different time periods, showing how trauma can be passed down. It's really a sad and depressing look into the lackluster life of Jimmy, whose lonely existence is almost unbearable to witness in such detail. Lost Dogs. This is one of the most tragic comics on the list. It also has one of the most interesting art styles as well. It follows a sailor that is a real giant of a man. He's just trying to live his life with his wife and daughter and takes a trip into the city for a day out. His daughter asks to see the boats by the docks, but when they get there, they're attacked by a gang who beat the giant within an inch of his life, rape his wife, and kill his daughter. Yeah, I know, what a left turn. He's found and patched up by an old man named Jack who believes the giant is an answer to his prayers. He wants to use the giant to challenge Walleye Thompson, the undefeated champion of the underground fighting circuit, and if he does, Jack will tell him where his wife is, who supposedly survived the attack. So that's the gist of it. It's a dark, gritty tale, and it's a sad one. Mouse. Mouse is a biography of sorts created by Art Spiegelman. In the comic, Spiegelman asks his father about living through the Holocaust, and we see his harrowing experiences in flashbacks. What's interesting about this comic isn't just the tragic storytelling, but the cartoonish art style that depicts the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. Meg, Mog, and Owl. This is a series of bizarre comics starring Meg the witch, Mog the cat, and Owl the roommate. It's the type of comic you start reading and have a hard time putting down because it's so messed up and weird. You just want to see what happens next. Meg and Mog are huge stoners that are constantly high, and we basically watch their messed up lives full of strange and degrading events. A lot of the time, they're messing with their roommate Owl and do all kinds of messed up stuff to him. Like when he passed out and they took his pants off and wheeled him through the drive-thru in a shopping cart. Or when he had to use the bathroom really bad and they locked him outside so he was forced to shit in the yard. It's very chaotic, and there are 100 little moments like this. All their friends are degenerates too, and at one point they throw a party where they all see who has the grossest feet. Then their wolf friend decides to do a bizarre stunt where he uses a cheese grater on his balls. No joke. It's one of the cringiest things I've seen while working on this iceberg. So yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of what you're in for with this one. Monsters. Monsters by Barry Windsor Smith is a large and complex story that is hard to put into a paragraph, but I'll give you the gist. A young disfigured man with a troubled past, Bobby Bailey, is recruited into a secret super soldier program in the 1960s. This program is run by a sadistic man who takes inspiration from the horrific experiments done in World War II by the Nazis. This experiment, however, is somewhat a success, as Bobby is turned into a grotesque monstrosity like a messed up version of the Hulk. Meanwhile, Sergeant Elias McFarland, the recruiter who recommended Bailey for the experiment, is riddled with guilt and terrified about what horrors await this kid. What's more fascinating is that Elias actually has some psychic abilities that are described similarly to The Shining from the Stephen King novel. Anyway, I didn't know what to expect from this one, but damn, it is a deep dive into human tragedy. I highly recommend it if you have the time to read this behemoth of a graphic novel. Mr. Punch. The tragical comedy or comical tragedy of Mr. Punch is a really weird one. It's a vague story told by an unknown narrator who recaps some moments of his strange and blurry childhood. Most notably are the emergence of several Mr. Punch and Judy puppet shows that are completely unhinged. At one point, Mr. Punch kills his wife Judy and their baby. This puppet show, of course, is a metaphor for the chaos of the boy's real life. Really, I think this comic is most notable for the art, which was done by Dave McKean. This is the same artist known for his work on Arkham Asylum and Sandman. There's a really creepy mix of real photos photos and paintings. Specifically, the images of Mr. Punch and the baby are very disturbing. Pinocchio 2011. I actually did a full breakdown of this comic if you want to check it out, but this twisted version of Pinocchio is a complete retelling of the story. What if Pinocchio was not a wooden puppet, but a robotic war machine, and Geppetto wasn't a kind man in search of a son, but a greedy inventor looking to sell his weapon of war to the military for a fortune? The fox is a drug addict, Jiminy is a depressed cockroach, and Pleasure Island is a dilapidated theme park. Instead of turning young boys into donkeys, it turns them into wolves who are used by a sadistic clown to gain control of the region. It's a world full of death, tragedy, and despicable people. As Pinocchio embarks on his adventure, we see the grim and harsh reality of this strange world. While we're doing Pinocchio, let's touch on another disturbing version of the story, Pinocchio, Story of a Child. Unfortunately, this one hasn't been translated to English and is hard to get a hold of, but I did find a French wiki article on it to give us some insight into the story. This is essentially an inverse of the original adventures of Pinocchio. Everyone in this world are puppets, and Geppetto makes Pinocchio out of flesh in a butcher shop. In a world full of lies, Pinocchio's nose only grows when he tells the truth. Pretty interesting take, and despite not knowing the language, the images are absolutely terrifying. This fleshy, sewn up version of Pinocchio will be creeping into my nightmares, I'm sure. Skin. This is a really weird one. It follows Martin, a deformed young man with a big attitude. He has phocomelia, a condition where a person has only hands without fully developed arms. He's a reckless, foul-mouthed, horny little bastard, and this comic is a tragic unraveling of his life. It's pretty sad and really graphic. At one point, Martin attacks a man, rips his arms off, and ties them to his shoulders to replicate having fully developed arms. It's really messed up, man. Upgrade Soul. This is a really fascinating comic that I would love to do a full explanation video on. Upgrade Soul follows an elderly couple who volunteer to undergo an experimental procedure that promises to rejuvenate them, essentially regenerating their bodies and minds to a more optimal form. However, the experiment goes wrong. Instead of enhanced versions of themselves, the procedure instead produces deformed clones of them. The thing is, the grotesque clones have all the same memories and emotions of the couple. So from here, it's a disturbing and emotional look at both sets of couples and how they deal with this horrific event, calling into question their identity and worth as humans. Well, there you have it. Let me know if you found any of these entries particularly interesting, and I'd be happy to do a standalone deep dive on it. As far as I can tell, there will probably be 2 more parts, maybe 3 of this series, and then of course I'll put the entire thing out as one big marathon video. Shout out to Kill Me Katie as always for the intro and outro music, which is likely playing right now. And if you want to see your art at the end of my videos, email it to me with a social media handle or name at the address below. Finally, big thank you to my patrons for supporting my channel. If you want your name displayed at the end of every video like these fine people, consider joining my Patreon. But I appreciate you guys watching at all. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.